This is the Fantasy Football Podcast, where we take data and convert it into fantasy success. No bias, no hot takes, only victory. This is the Fantasy Alchemist Podcast, and now your host, Dustin Chandry. Welcome to episode 16 of the Fantasy Alchemist Podcast. I'm your host, Dustin Chandry. Thanks for tuning in. Now, before we get started on who I think you should be starting in Week 3, I want to quickly touch base on the news yesterday of Rams running back, or former running back now, Cam Akers, getting traded to the Minnesota Vikings. And let me just say up front, I'm not concerned at all. Okay, the Rams have been trying to unload Akers for over a year now. And in week 1, Akers had over 20 carries, and he averaged 1.3 yards per carry. That's almost impossible to do at this level. Last year, the lowest yards per carry for a running back with at least 20 carries in a game was 1.9. And according to Next Gen Stats, Cam Akers has the second worst rush yards over expected in the league. If that isn't enough, the Vikings, they did not give up anything to acquire him. The Rams couldn't even get an outright late pick. They couldn't get an outright 6th or 7th round pick. Instead, they got a 6th round pick swap. That's practically, here, take Akers because we don't want him anywhere near our team. And Akers is on the last year of his rookie deal. I doubt he will be in Minnesota this time next year. Now, as for Alexander Mattison, I wasn't really high on Mattison prior to the trade, but I really don't view him any less because of it either. I think you can continue to safely rank Alexander Mattison in the running back 20 to 25 range on a given week, and he still is flex consideration worthy to me. In redraft leagues, if you are running back needy, I think you could offer a fringe wide receiver 3, maybe even wide receiver 4, in exchange for Mattison as a bench running back pickup. And that could be valuable depth for you as we get into the bye weeks. Now, for today's episode, I do want to call out 8 players. This will be 3 running backs, 4 wide receivers, and 1 tight end that I think you should seriously consider in your starting lineups for Week 3. These are players who, based on Week 3 rankings from ESPN, they will be outside the top 20 at running back, top 25 at wide receiver, and outside the top 10 at tight end. But I think they all have a strong likelihood of finishing within those parameters within Week 3. But before we get started, I want to let you know that you can follow the show on Twitter. It is at FFAlchemistPod. Again, it is at FFAlchemistPod. You can also email the show directly at fantasyalchemistpodcast@gmail.com. So let's get into the players that you should not be afraid to start in Week 3. You should start Buccaneers running back Rachaad White. Rachaad White is getting truly elite usage through the first 2 weeks of the season. Now, I want to credit Alex Caruso on Twitter for this because he highlighted this, but Rachaad White is one of 4 running backs to have played over 100 snaps and has had a 75% snap participation in the first 2 weeks. He's also one of 4 running backs with over 60% of snaps on pass plays, and he's one of 9 running backs with 100% of goal line work. Most of the other running backs in all of those comps are well inside the top 10 of the weekly rankings. Rachaad White is currently running back 24 in ESPN's Week 3 rankings. You see, White, last week, he finished as running back 8. He had over 21 fantasy points, 100 total yards. He had 5 receptions on 6 targets, and he had a touchdown. Start Rachaad White. Another running back with truly elite usage last week was Colts running back Zach Moss. Now, in his season debut, Moss played 98% of snaps, and he averaged 4 yards per carry, and he got 4 targets. Moss had over 100 total yards and a touchdown. He scored nearly 18 fantasy points. Now, Colts quarterback Anthony Richardson, he is still in concussion protocol, and he is questionable for Week 3. And Richardson already has 3 rushing touchdowns on the season. If Richardson is out, the Colts will start Gardner Minshew, which will leave Moss with a near lock on any red zone and goal line rushing attempts. Zach Moss is currently ranked running back 21 on the week. And then the last running back is Chargers running back Joshua Kelly. Now look, I know Josh Kelly burned you last week. He did me too. But Austin Eckler is likely going to miss Week 3. Kelly has a prime spot Sunday against the Vikings. And we just saw how badly the Vikings got beat on the ground by the Eagles last week. Now, last week, Kelly dominated snaps. He played over 80% of snaps with Austin Eckler out, and I anticipate Eckler will be out again with the ankle injury. Now, the Titans have one of the best run defenses in the league, and they did contain Kelly, but he still averaged 3 yards per carry. The previous week, week 1 against the Dolphins, Josh Kelly had 5.7 yards per carry. Now, Kelly also ran almost 20 routes last week against the Titans, albeit he only got 1 target. And lastly, the Chargers have the 3rd highest implied total of the week against Minnesota. Kelly has elite usage in a prime matchup against a suspect opponent. Kelly is currently running back 27, but I think he will likely move up even more once Eckler is confirmed out for week 3. Now, for the wide receiver group, there are 4 wide receivers I'm going to highlight that are currently outside the top 25 of the week 3 rankings, one that is even outside the top 40. But first, let's start with wide receiver 27, and that is Tyler Lockett of the Seattle Seahawks. Now, the Seahawks had a concerning week 1. The entire pass offense did, but that unit rebounded pretty strongly in week 2. Lockett finished as wide receiver 6 last week. He had 8 receptions on 11 targets. He had 2 touchdowns. Lockett, through 2 games, he has the largest target share on the team at 24%, whereas DK Metcalf and JSN are currently at 18% each. And Lockett has over 40% of the team's air yards. And lastly, Lockett is only one of 2 wide receivers in the entire league right now with at least 5 end zone targets. T. Higgins is the other. Now, Metcalf is also questionable. I'm assuming he's going to play through that rib injury, but Lockett is still a solid flex option even at his wide receiver 27 ranking for week 3. The next wide receiver is Nico Collins of the Houston Texans, currently wide receiver 30 on the weekly rankings. Now, Collins has had a strong downfield usage in both games to start the season. It didn't come together for a strong fantasy performance in week 1, but it sure did in week 2. Last week he finished as wide receiver 5. Nico Collins has 20 targets through 2 games. Only 5 wide receivers have more targets at this point. And all of the wide receivers with at least 15 targets through 2 games, only George Pickens has a higher yards per reception. Collins is averaging over 17 yards per reception after 2 weeks. Because of his high target volume and an average depth of target close to 14 yards, Nico Collins is currently 4th in the league in air yards with almost 43% of his team's air yards. Collins is ranked wide receiver 30 this week, but I think he is a great flex option. Now, the next option is very much a high-risk play for the week. Given where the Arizona Cardinals are at, the lowest implied total of the week right now at 15 points, but I think Marquise Hollywood Brown, currently ranked as wide receiver 36 for the week, is in a prime spot for the guy who can pad his stats in the second half of a garbage time sort of scenario where the Cowboys could run away with this game very early. Now, last week, Hollywood Brown, he finished with 10 targets and a touchdown. He finished as wide receiver 22 with 17 points. Hollywood also got a target on a third of his routes run last week. And assuming the Cardinals get into a negative game script, Hollywood could backdoor his way into a solid week 3. And then lastly, we have to talk about Christian Kirk, currently wide receiver 42 on the week 3 rankings. Now, Jacksonville has the 6th highest implied odds of the week, and wide receiver Zay Jones is questionable with a knee injury. If Zay Jones is out, I think Kirk should be well inside the top 25 of his position rankings for the week. And again, he's currently wide receiver 42, even though he finished as wide receiver 13 last week. He had 11 receptions on 14 targets and over 100 yards receiving. Now, what's important for Christian Kirk is that his snap participation and his routes run both jumped from week 1 to week 2. His snap participation went from 61% to 80% in week 2, and his number of routes run went from 22 to 39. If Zay Jones is out, you should absolutely start Kirk in your flex. But even if Zay Jones is available, I still think Christian Kirk is flex worthy. And then lastly, your one tight end recommendation for the week that is outside the top 10 is Hunter Henry of the Patriots. He's currently listed as tight end 15 in the week 3 rankings. Now, Hunter Henry is tight end 2 in fantasy points after 2 weeks. He's finished in the top 3 in both week 1 and week 2 scoring. Each of the first 2 weeks, Henry is basically catching 5 of 6 targets, 50 yards receiving, and a touchdown. He scored a touchdown in both games. And Henry's target share is below 14%, which is nearly outside the top 20 at tight end. However, This is because the Patriots have the largest share of targets to distribute. You see, the Pats are playing at the fastest pace in the league currently, and they are passing at a 3-to-1 ratio over rushing attempts, and that has led Mac Jones to having the largest number of passing attempts in the league through 2 weeks. Henry is ranked tight end 15 on the week, but I think he should be well inside the top 10. I would start Henry over any of the following tight ends: Kyle Pitts, Dalton Schultz, Cole Kmet, Zach Ertz, David Njoku. All tight ends who are currently ranked ahead of him in the Week 3 rankings. So that'll do it for this episode. Make sure to hit subscribe as we will return early next week with key observations and trends from around the league following Week 3. This is Dustin Chandry for the Fantasy Alchemist Podcast. Thank you for listening to the Fantasy Alchemist Podcast. You can follow the pod on Twitter at FFAlchemistPod or email us at fantasyalchemistpodcast@gmail.com.